Chapter 18. The Earth Calls Frightful. And then it happened. Frightful hopped from limb to limb until she reached the wispy top of the ancient hemlock. She turned her head slowly as she took a bearing on the sun's rays. She fixed on a longitude between 90 and 70 degrees. After many takes, the direction was indelibly printed on her brain. She pointed her head and body along the invisible line. She bent her knees and ankles. She lowered her wings. "Alice," Sam whispered, "Frightful's leaving us." "How do you know?" "Look at her. She has that southward concentration of migrating birds. I've seen it in robins and blackbirds." Frightful flew. She did not look back. "But she loves you," Alice said. "She can't go. She doesn't know what to do without you." "But she does," said Sam, watching her disappear. "She's flying south." "Come back in the spring," he called, and then added, "I'll be waiting." Sam climbed the old hemlock, trying to catch one last glimpse of his beloved bird. She was already far away. She rode the prevailing wind over the familiar mountains and rivers and beyond the Catskills into unknown territory. She did not hesitate or turn back. She memorized the landscape as she flew, forests, rivers, highways, and cities. In 1 hour she saw the Atlantic Ocean ahead. Its plantless expanse told her it was not the way to go. She came down on a tor above the Hudson River and perched in an isolated ash tree. A Cooper's hawk and two red tails were hunting not far away. Frightful noted the moisture in the air, the clouds, the wind, and the other migrating birds passing overhead. Blackbirds swarmed over the cattail swamp at the bottom of Hook Mountain. In the morning, the sky was clear and blue. She perched in the top of the ash, waiting for the earth to warm and the wind to rise and to carry her on her way. She took off about 9 o'clock. "Peregrine!" a man on the top of Hook Mountain shouted with gusto. He was seated before a spotting scope. "That makes 40 peregrines for the month," said a woman sitting on the camp stool. She put a check beside Peregrine Falcon in the Raptor counting book. The tour top was speckled with men and women who came to Hook Mountain in the autumn to count the birds of prey. Each year, these people, like thousands of others, tallied raptors along the 4 migratory flyways in North America: the Atlantic, Mississippi Central, and Pacific flyways. They counted because the birds of prey were losing ground in the fight for survival. By comparing their numbers each year, the counters could tell whether or not their efforts to ban pesticides and pass laws protecting the birds were working. The birds of prey were vital to the health of North America. The people on Hook Mountain cheered when Frightful went over. A peregrine was a thrill to see. The bird had been eliminated by DDT and pesticides in much of the United States in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Even now was still a rare sight, a beautiful, rare sight. Frightful's wings cut circles in the wind that sped her southeast towards the ocean. Abreast of New York City, she sensed she was off course. Her internal compass and the increasing moisture in the air sent her westward. Rough air bounced her back and forth, but she found her longitude again over New Jersey marshlands. She dropped down to rest on the post of a duck blind. A shotgun blasted. She took off, skimmed low over the tops of the sedges until she found a thermal and rode it, ringing swiftly up, barely moving her wings as it carried her out of range of the duck hunter's guns. Soaring, tipping, circling at the top of the thermal was Drum. "Cree, cree, cree," she called. Her first Turriselius answered with nestling talk. "Zwee!" Then adult talk. "Cree, cree, cree." They sped out of the thermal together and started down the coast. They flew extremely high, keeping the ocean on their left. Drum had taken this trip last year. He picked smooth winds between towers of clouds as he led Frightful through the sky. Frightful and Drum and several other birds of prey kept each other in sight. Traveling together, they formed a sky club. Before long, they came to know each other and passed on information about weather and the terrain. The experienced ones knew to come down early before a storm. Others sensed turbulence approaching and took detours around destructive winds. Over Virginia, a sudden gust of dry air pushed Frightful ahead of Drum. She had learned at Delhi that such a wind would be followed by a cold front. She flew faster to keep ahead of it. 600 miles from Hook Mountain, she came down on a utility pole at Cape Hatteras. 15 minutes later, Drum joined her. Dropping out of the sky by twos and ones came the goshawk, the kestrel, and the red-tailed, and the sharp-shined, the bird club. They spread out over the vast wetland. Frightful looked down on the black ducks, mallards, blue-winged teals, plovers, godwits, yellow-legged sandpipers, all the migrating birds that loved wetlands. At the sight of a peregrine falcon, they vanished. Frightful did not chase them. She was looking for pigeons and rats, but actually was not very hungry. She was living on her migratory fat. Perched on the pole, she oiled her feathers, which had become dry at the high altitudes. Drum oiled his on the mast of the sailboat that had been dumped in the marsh by a long-ago storm. In the morning, Frightful did not follow Drum southward. The wind was wrong. It was coming from the southeast, bending the trees to the northwest. She recalled the winds that had preceded the storm on the Scullery Reservoir and flew inland to the little town of Plymouth, North Carolina. She landed on the bell tower of a church. She knew a church tower well, found one of the open windows, and walked in. Drum had not gone far before he realized the winds were wrong. He backflipped in the air and came down on the water tupelo tree about 3 miles from Frightful. The tree had grown great buttresses to support it in storms in the watery soil. Frightful in her church and Drum in his tupelo sat quietly through screaming gusts and dead calms. They preened. Frightful watched a duck fly into the reeds and a willet find shelter behind a dense clump of sedge. The next day the winds were stronger. Lengths of clouds became stringy clusters of gray. Frightful stayed in her church tower and Drum settled closer to the bole of the tupelo tree. 2 nights later, wind-blown rain began to fall, first in light dribbles, then in gushes. The ducks and geese and herons hunkered down in the sedges and reeds. The warblers had gone inland to the pine forests. They pushed close to the tree trunks. The falcons and hawks sought shelter in forests and buildings. Those that had felt the lowering pressure of the storm before Frightful and Drum had felt them and flown west to get around it. They were sleeping in Kentucky and Tennessee. Around 2 o'clock, Frightful's church tower vibrated in the high wind. A shutter was torn from its rectory. It clattered on the street, breaking into splinters. The lights in the town went out. Frightful awoke from time to time when the wind blew so hard it rang the church bells. She shook off the rain, coming horizontally in through the window, then put her beak into the feathers of her back and went to sleep. Drum was not as comfortable. His tupelo tree lashed and coiled like a whip in the wind. He crouched, tightening his grip on the limb, and faced into the storm. Hours passed. Just before dawn, a tidal wave 6 feet high roared across the marsh. It was seawater that had been lifted up into the center of the hurricane by the low pressure. It hit the base of Drum's tree and rose so fast that Drum was forced to fly. He could not see well, but he knew the direction of the forest. Beating his wet wings, he was carried, rolling and tumbling, low over the marshland. He crashed into a hill of groundsel bushes and wedged his way into their dense center. Then he climbed away from the rising water. Drum went lower into the bushes just as a 110-mile-an-hour wind struck. It ripped everything. It ripped off every groundswell leaf, leaving the limbs bare. Gripping with all his strength, Drum faced into the storm, his streamlined body minimizing the wind. Then came the calm. The eye of the storm passed through Plymouth at about 2 in the afternoon. Frightful was awakened by the all-encompassing silence. Drum sat still. This was no time to fly. Half awake, half asleep, he waited. In the morning, the eye of the hurricane was off to the north, and far side of the storm stuck the marshland. It was less forceful. The winds blew west now. Frightful stayed in the church tower. Drum stayed in the flooded ground shell bushes. The rain slowed, and the tide receded. By the end of the day, the hurricane was off Cape Hatteras, on its way north, and the sun came out. Frightful caught one of the several wet rats that had retreated to the church and crawled up to the bell tower. Drum shook the water from his feathers and flew inland, and he climbed high, found a brisk wind, and sailed down the coast toward Florida. Frightful took off around noon. She also climbed high, although she had never seen the swamps and forests of Georgia and Florida. She sensed their place and recorded them on her visual mind, navigating with the members of her bird club. They had weathered the storm in trees and docks inland from the Cape. Left behind were gaggles of ducks and geese. They had found their winter destination. But the peregrine falcons flew on. 2 days after the storm, Frightful came down in a Florida sable palm and noted her global position again, 80 degrees longitude. She took off and flew over the tip of Florida. The club had dispersed. Each had gone on its own ancestral wintering grounds. 2 new companions joined Frightful, one an older peregrine falcon and the other a young tercel. The winds were light, and Frightful had to work hard to keep up her speed with the warm air below the Tropic of Cancer. She stopped overnight in Cuba and flew on the next day. Immediately she was over open water with no landmarks. She guided herself by the rays of the sun. When the clouds piled up in the late afternoon, she came down off a key of the shore of Belize and caught food and rested and went on. She was alone now. She followed her directional line over the Caribbean Sea and caught up with Drum as they were approaching the Isthmus of Panama. Drum looped in greeting. They flew in tandem to the palm and ficus trees of Barro, Colorado Island, and came to rest in the black mangrove trees. Colorado Island, they did not eat. A great urgency drove them on. In the morning, they were over the Pacific Ocean, headed for Chile. The winds changed from smooth glass to bumps. Drum recognized the edge of a tropical storm and turned east. Frightful flew west. She also recognized the texture of the air and the color of the sky that foretold atmospheric trouble, but chose to fly around the disturbance. Drum's course took him back to his wintering grounds on the Chilean shore. Frightful flew for almost an hour to get around the storm before turning south. No land was in sight. She flew on. In the late afternoon, she held her wings straight out to save glide and save energy. She dropped closer and closer to the surface of the ocean. She saw no resting place, not even a boat. She flew all night. At sunup, she was still just above the water, her wings outstretched, gliding to find a badly needed bit of land. All was water. As she looked and glided, a flock of storm petrels winged by. They wheeled in the orange sunrise. A flock of blue-winged teals flew with them. There were no birds of the ocean. They were birds of the land. Land was near. Frightful summoned new energy and climbed into the sky, and in the distance she saw a green-gray island. With a last effort, she pumped her wings and flew straight ahead and came down on a Palo Santo tree on Espanola Island. Birds flew lazily above it. Male frigate birds were with bright and red balloon-like sacks under their chins cruised the shore. Not 3 feet from Frightful, 7 little black Darwin cactus finches were busily gleaning food. She waited for them to flee. All birds fled from her. The Darwin finches kept on hopping and eating. They did not know they should be aware of predators. Frightful had arrived in the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles out in the Pacific Ocean, where the birds and reptiles had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps millions, without predators. They were totally unafraid. Frightful was unable to chase the friendly birds. They did not fly away from her because they did not. She was not inspired to chase them. She was exhausted and hungry amid friendly creatures. She was watching them, growing listless from hunger, when a wheeling flock of sanderlings and windbrews from the continent flew past. They acted familiarly. They flew together and apart at the sight of a predator, and Frightful dove into the midst. She gave chase and finally ate. Returning to the Palo Santo tree, she rested not far from the group of Galapagos mockingbirds. They were not as innocent as little finches. They were attacking everything, iguanas, birds, other mockingbirds, and Frightful herself. They did not know she was a predator, but they did like any other living thing in their territory. But they did not like any other living thing in their territory. They swooped and dove and pestered. She returned the compliment. She swooped and dove, and they all stayed away. From her perch, she watched the young sea lion cubs and their mothers tumbling on the beach. The huge bulls were in the water. They roared and bellowed when another male came near their harem and offspring. Something moved at the foot of Frightful's tree. She focused. A 3-foot-long land iguana was chewing cactus fruit. His dragon-like spines and thick skin sent a strong message to her. He was not food. For several hours, Frightful bobbed her head and looked from one strange animal to another in this world of ancient survivors. At sunset, clouds piled up like purple mountains, forecasting rain. Frightful flew to a shelter she had pinpointed on her arrival. She crossed the water to Gardiner's Island and alighted on a steep lava cliff of cracks and niches. All were occupied by blue-footed big birds with startling blue feet. They chased her off her properties. She dropped to another shelter and was ushered out by Galapagos penguins. These perky, upright birds had been lost from the ice islands of Antarctica hundreds of thousands of years ago, and unable to swim back, had adjusted to the tropical heat. They cooled off by lifting their wings, panting and jumping into icy water. Frightful left the penguins and blue-footed boobies to their caves and niches and rounded the island looking for shelter. She came upon another cave on the western cliff facing the oncoming storm. The cave was scoured by wind, sea, and water, and was deep enough for shelter. She walked into it.